I've been discussing for the last few lessons about how Texas is changing and how it's slowly becoming something other than what it had been. I mean, the world is changing. People change, time changes. So where does Texas fit into this sort of story of change within the United States? Well, it's really about oil. Oil changes everything. Texas has always had oil. In fact, the first sighting of oil is probably about 1543. Spanish explorers that were going along the coast of Texas mentioned it near present-day High Island, which is on across from Galveston on the Texas coast down the Bolivar Peninsula between Galveston Bay and Sabine Pass. Frederick Law Olmsted, when he comes through Texas in 1854, talks about oil near Sour Lake, Texas. So this is oil that's just kind of bubbling up on top of the ground. Lynn T. Barret is an entrepreneur near Nacogdoches. He actually tries to start a distillery of sorts in which he's taking surface oil and trying to extract kerosene for the kerosene market. Doesn't go anywhere, but he's recognizing that there's some commercial value to this ick that's bubbling up on the surface. In 1886, for instance, there's an account of a rancher drilling a water well near San Antonio, and he kept having his efforts thwarted because instead of striking water, he kept striking oil, which was not what he was after. And so oil is there. It just is waiting for the market and the industry to catch up with it. Well, the first successful refinery is in the mid to late 1890s. And the production from these first refineries is pretty modest, about 839,000 barrels a year, which sounds like a lot, but we're going to put those sorts of numbers in the shade. The Corsicana oil field is really what starts the ball rolling. Corsicana opens up in 1900 and brought in an additional 637,000 barrels by 1906. So it's a modest contribution to the overall oil scene, but it's really the first one where you have a systematic exploration and exploitation of the oil. It's Gladys City down around Beaumont that really changes the emphasis. I mean, understand there's oil being produced elsewhere in the United States, especially in western Pennsylvania. And Texas is a bit player by this point, but people are starting to figure out that there's reserves. Well, some of the folks that are figuring out that there may be some oil play down on the Texas coast include a bunch of folks that pooled their resources and started what they called the Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company. These guys included some names that you might be familiar with, like Pattillo Higgins, but also George W. O'Brien, George W. Carroll, Emma E. John, and J.F. Lanier. So in 1892, they're looking out around the area south of Beaumont and looking for places where there might be oil. And what they keep focusing on is a mound out on that coastal prairie that locals referred to as Spindletop. It was a place where you had some high ground around some pretty low swampy ground, and had been a favorite camping spot for folks traversing that area. Confederate soldiers, for instance, camped there during the American Civil War. And so they said, you know, there may be something underneath this mound. At this time, salt domes were seen as being potential sources for petroleum. Problem is, they didn't have the technology. So they drill 3 shallow wells using what are called cable rig drilling devices, and they just don't hit anything. And what they're doing is they're just not going deep enough. Finally, Higgins and Lanier bail out of the Gladys City operation in 1895. Higgins is still convinced that there's something there. Not all of the rest of his partners are convinced. They're starting to look elsewhere. But Higgins is going, no, it is right here. We just haven't figured out how to get to it. So he teams up with a new partner, Anthony Lucas. And Lucas brings to the table a great deal of expertise in salt dome formations. He understands what's going on beneath the earth. And you would think that Higgins and Lucas could make this thing happen, but they also fail. Still, they do not tap that well. All right. So what ends up happening then is they start looking for other expertise. There's some Pittsburgh area oil veterans like John H. Galey and James M. Guffey. And they come in and say, all right, you guys making a pretty convincing argument. So I'll tell you what, we will help finance you, Lucas, who has all the smarts and all the expertise, but we're not so crazy about Pattillo Higgins. And so we'll go with Lucas, but we will not go if Lucas comes with Higgins. So Higgins is out. Lucas, with all of his brain power and his expertise, says, all right, where are they drilling successfully in Texas? That would be up in Corsicana. So he brings in Al and Curt Hamill, who are veterans of that Corsicana strike, and says, you know what? You guys can be the drilling team. I'll be the guy that tells you where to drill and to dig in and get that oil, while we let our Pennsylvania partners finance the whole operation. On October 27th, 1900, they bring in a well, but it's pretty anemic, pretty sluggish. Even so, the Pennsylvanians say, all right, there's something there. Let's give it another try and see if we go deeper and slightly in a different location, if we'll finally hit something. Well, they hit something. January 10th, 1901, they bring in what becomes known as the Lucas Geyser. The Lucas Geyser literally blows the pipe out of the ground. There is so much underground oil pressure, and the oil just shoots sky high in a huge fountain. It's absolutely stunning, but there's clearly oil down there, and it's high pressure oil. It takes them, better part of a week and a half to get that oil flow under control. And in the meantime, it's just spewing all over everything. Running down creek bottoms and just turning the ground into sludge. But as you can imagine, it attracts a lot of attention. So by September, there's 6 additional wells around there, and Beaumont becomes a boomtown. Mushrooms from a sleepy little coastal town of about 10,000 people, actually inland from the coast, to a boomtown of 50,000 people within weeks. Spindletop, that hit, the Lucas Geyser, that really begins the major modern oil industry in the United States, and it will absolutely change the history of Texas, no doubt, but it really changes the history of the entire planet.